Welcome. So I'm Aaron Jackson at Bentley University in the Department of Economics. So here we're talking about the last part of Chapter 4, which looks at saving and investment from a long-run perspective. Now, again, the main point of this chapter is to understand two primary things: what drives the real interest rate and also what drives trade flows in the longer term. And so those are really important questions that we want to ask. And so it all really comes down to thinking about what a goods market equilibrium is and what that goods market equilibrium looks like. That helps us explain both of those questions. But the problem with these models is that it doesn't allow us to have some sort of unified approach to answering these two questions of, one, what drives real interest rates, and also what drives trade flows in the longer term. And so that necessitates that we have two separate models to try to help us understand these two different questions. And so it doesn't work very well for countries like the United States and other large open economies, and I'll get to that at the end of this lecture. But for now, we're going to set that aside, and so we're going to focus on this issue of thinking about net exports and trade flows and how trade flows move across countries over the longer term, and specifically what are the factors underlying that and driving that. And so in order to understand the assumptions behind this, we're going to have two basic assumptions. So when we think about a small open economy, so if a country is small and open, then the idea is that you would have perfect capital mobility in the sense that we assume that there's no trade barriers or restrictions of capital into or out of the country. And so the idea is very simply that the country is sort of a price taker in the sense that it doesn't have any ability to control these things because it is so small. And so by necessity, it has to have perfect capital mobility. And so, again, by definition, if we're assuming that an economy is open and they have perfect capital mobility, this means that we can have trade flows into and out of that country. So unlike in the previous version, the closed economy version, where we assumed that net exports were zero and there was no trade flows, here we're assuming that net exports can occur. So you can have exports and imports into and out of the country. And the second assumption is that we assume the country is small enough that it cannot influence global market interest rates. And so that's sort of comes from the fact that we assume that this country is small. So you can think of Switzerland or Liechtenstein or some sort of small European country. They have some economic activity that occurs, but because they're small relative to the size of the rest of the global financial markets, anything that happens within that country really isn't going to move the needle in terms of global financial markets. And so that's what we mean by the country being small enough that it's really not going to have an influence on world interest rates. And so the implication of that is that whatever interest rate that prevails in global financial markets is going to be the interest rate that prevails domestically within that country. So in other words, unlike what we saw in the previous section where we looked at a closed economy, in that example, when we had a closed economy, if you had a country that had variation in savings, changes in fiscal policy, those kinds of things, that changed domestic interest rates. Here, as we'll see, that's not going to be the case. Because of perfect capital mobility and because of the fact the country is small, it takes this interest rate as given, and that's just the interest rate that prevails throughout the economy. And so the interest rate that is set in the domestic economy is going to be fixed, and it's going to be fixed by global financial markets at what we refer to as the world real interest rate, which is that RW. So we're going to look at a goods market equilibrium. And so again, the notion of a goods market equilibrium is such that the amount of output that households, firms, and government and the net export sector purchase is exactly equal to what's being produced. And so like in the previous video where we saw a difference between how we looked at it with the national income accounting identity and the relationship between saving and investment, we're going to do the same thing here. However, there's going to be a slight variation in what the goods market equilibrium looks like because of the fact that we're assuming this net export sector. So again, if you'll recall, our goods market equilibrium occurs when total production, Y, is exactly equal to C plus I plus G plus net X. Now, we rearrange that in a slightly different way to y minus c minus g minus I is equal to net x, okay? And so for the purposes of, excuse me, for the purposes of what we're doing here, we can simplify this, again, through that thing, which is savings minus investment, has got to be equal to net exports. So our goods market equilibrium, again, is assuming that production is equal to what people buy, or alternatively, it says that a goods market equilibrium in a small open economy is where savings minus investment has got to be equal to net exports. So those are two sides of the same coin, and they mean the same thing. Now, again, going back to the previous video, if you recall, in the closed economy case, we assumed that net exports was equal to 0, and so in that simpler case, our goods market equilibrium was such that saving was equal to investment. But now that we have trade flows, our goods market equilibrium is complicated a little bit by that distinction. So there's two cases that I guess are of importance that we can look at to see and distinguish between the closed economy case and the small open economy case. So now that we can have trade flows, we can have trade flows into and out of the country. And so if it's the case that the amount of savings minus investment is positive, as we've seen in previous videos, that also means that the amount of net exports is also positive. And what that implies is that you have a net capital outflow. So again, the intuition here is if savings minus investment is positive, the amount of domestic savings that's being generated by households and government, potentially, is more than what domestic firms want to borrow. And so there's an excess amount of funds available. What do people do with that? Well, you're not just going to sit on it and earn 0, but you want to loan that out. You can't loan it out domestically because we've already satisfied the demands of firms to want to borrow domestically. So you ship the money overseas and loan it to other countries. And so there's a surplus of funds domestically, and so those surplus of funds are loaned overseas, and so therefore you would see a net capital outflow in this case. And so as I just discussed there, the basic punchline is that because the amount of domestic saving generated is going to be larger than the amount of domestic investment demanded, that is the amount of loans demanded by firms, and so that's the difference there is going to be lent overseas. And so it turns out that this case requires that the world real interest rate that prevails in the global financial markets and also prevails in the domestic economy is going to be higher than the closed economy case that we looked at previously. And so this graph illustrates that exact example. So again, we're assuming that the real world interest rate that prevails globally and that the small open economy has to take as given is RW. And so that interest rate prevails in the small domestic economy implies that if we just read off of our savings curve at that interest rate, this is how much domestic savings is generated by households and government, okay? At that same world real interest rate, it's relatively high. And so what that means is that the amount of domestic investment, that is the amount of money that firms want to borrow to purchase capital and equipment and those kinds of things, is relatively low. And so, again, what this means is that you have a surplus of domestic saving over domestic investment. That difference, that gap, represents the amount of net capital outflows. So in other words, the amount of net capital outflows, since S minus I is positive, that just represents those net capital outflows. Okay. And so if we, again, compare this to in a closed market, a closed economy situation, again, if we were to close this economy off, we would suddenly find ourselves at this goods market equilibrium of R star. And at that point, savings is equal to investment. There's no surplus or shortfall in that case. And so you end up at that equilibrium, that goods market equilibrium in a closed economy case. But in the open economy that we're looking at here, our goods market equilibrium occurs at that point where we're at the real world interest rate. The flip side of it is looking at net capital inflows. Okay, so this is a situation where, excuse me, this is a situation where there's a shortfall of saving relative to what firms want to borrow. And so in order to satisfy that borrowing, firms have to borrow from overseas lenders. And so you have an inflow of capital into the country as a result. And so that's generated by a condition where it's the opposite of what we had before. Savings minus investment is going to be negative. Okay, so that's where the shortfall of capital is domestically. And that also is consistent with net exports also being negative. So you have a trade deficit. And so, as I said, that represents a net capital inflow. Again, the basic intuition is such that with domestic savers, so households and maybe the government as well, there's a shortfall of savings that's available to satisfy what domestic firms want to borrow to purchase capital and equipment and those kinds of things. And so what has to happen is, in order to satisfy the demands of firms to invest, they have to borrow from overseas. And so that's what this shortfall represents, is this net capital inflow here. And so, excuse me. And so this requires the opposite case that we saw before, where the real world interest rate is actually lower than the closed goods market equilibrium real interest rate that we saw before. And so here's the case where you have net capital inflows as a goods market equilibrium. So in this case, if our real world interest rate were down here, at that interest rate, you can see that since the interest rate is relatively low, there's less of an incentive for households to save. And so the quantity of savings overall is going to be much lower compared to what we saw before. And so at that real interest rate that prevails in global financial markets and the small domestic economy here, we have that level of saving. And at that same real world interest rate, though, again, because it's relatively low, that means the cost of borrowing funds is relatively low. And so firms are going to want to borrow to invest in new capital and equipment. And so the demand for those funds is relatively high, and the amount of desired investment by firms is high. And so what this means then is that there's a shortfall between the amount of domestic savings that occurs in the economy versus the amount of investment that firms want to borrow to purchase capital and equipment from. That shortfall, again, is made up by borrowing from overseas. And so the difference between saving and investment here is the amount of net capital inflows. Okay, so more specifically, I should say the amount of investment minus saving, since that number is positive, represents the amount of net capital inflows into the economy. Again, as I mentioned before, if we suddenly found this economy in a closed market, economy framework, then we would end up at that real interest rate R star. Okay. So how are we to think about where the U.S. economy fits in with this story? So again, the main point of this chapter really is to focus less on the interest rate effects, but focus more on understanding the trade flows and how we can understand trade flows. And so it turns out in the U.S. case, for a pretty long time, several decades, perhaps longer, the U.S. has experienced a persistent trade deficit and net capital inflows into the U.S. Okay, and so there's two primary sources for this. The first is the persistent trade deficit. So we've seen, again, since the 1980s, I believe, that the U.S. has persistently ran trade deficits. And so that's primarily driven by high consumption rates. So that in and of itself, higher consumption is going to lead to lower saving, which is going to widen that gap. But also, you can think about it on the imports and export side. A lot of that consumption is driven more by cheaper imported goods. And so the more imports have increased through in consumption, that's also had the effect of lowering net exports and worsening the trade deficit. And then the second part of this is the persistent budget deficits. As we looked at in previous videos, an increase in government spending, a cut in taxes, or both of those are going to generate larger budget deficits. And those, as it turns out, also reduce national saving. And so what that means is that when you reduce national saving, it widens the gap between investment and saving. And so you get a bigger increase, a bigger gap between investment demanded by firms domestically and savings. And so that represents a larger shortfall. So both of these things, excuse me, both of these things, the persistent trade deficits as well as the persistent budget deficits are both referred to as the twin deficits. And so that's something you can see here. The trade deficit is in purple and the budget deficit is in the red. And so you can see both of those have been positive, which is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. And those both have contributed to these twin deficits for quite some time. So the issue then is to think about, well, what do we do about these? And the answers are obvious. I sort of gave it away in thinking about the sources of these twin deficits. The first is to reduce or eliminate the budget deficits. Reducing or eliminating budget deficits have the effect of increasing national savings, which again helps to close that gap between domestic investment demanded and the amount of savings available in the economy. And then the second piece of the puzzle is to create policies that encourage savings and discourage consumption. Again, both of those things are going to help to close that gap between saving and investment, and therefore close the gap in terms of the trade deficit and net capital inflows. And so this is just a basic, excuse me, this is just a basic example of the setup and how we can think about capturing this. So the idea is that if we were at an interest rate here, and we're thinking about this in a small open economy setting, right? Again, the idea is that the interest rate is taken as given. So in the U.S., we could have a situation where that's our domestic saving. Here's the level of domestic investment demanded, which is much larger than the amount of domestic saving generated in the economy. So we have this shortfall, which is our net capital inflows. So it's generated, again, by persistent budget deficits and high consumption rates of imports. Now, the way that we close that net capital inflow and that net export gap, as I said, is to raise savings in the economy. So if you can generate lower deficits or potentially higher budget surpluses and discourage consumption, that's going to have the effect of shifting the savings curve to the right. And as you can see, as we shift the savings curve to the right, that closes that gap between the domestic savings generated and the amount of domestic investment demanded at that interest rate. So in a perfect world, we could fully close that gap by increasing savings to S2 here, in which case you'd have savings exactly equal to investment and no capital inflows as a result of that. So I've talked about this model in the context of thinking about the U.S. and what it means for trade flows. But as I mentioned at the beginning, at the opening of this video, there's a disconnect between thinking about the U.S. as a small open economy, because it isn't, quite frankly, a small open economy. It's a large open economy. And yet, we also want to understand what happens to interest rates and understand how interest rates are affected in the longer term. And so I set up these two different models to talk about those two different things separately. So the question is, well, where does the U.S. really fit in thinking about these two models? And as it turns out, the U.S. really has elements of both of these things to help explain some of the facts that we were looking at. So first of all, as we talked about previously in the video, in a previous video, in a closed economy framework, that allows us to understand what drives real interest rates and changes in real interest rates over the long term. And so that's helpful for thinking about how the U.S. experience is and what drives real interest rates. But the problem is, of course, the U.S. is not closed. So that really isn't a handy model to think about the other things that are important, which are the trade flow. So the small open economy allows us to help explain trade flows in the U.S., but as we mentioned before, the U.S. is not small, and it certainly doesn't take the real world interest rate as given. In fact, because the U.S. is so large in terms of global financial markets, things that happen in the U.S. not only have an effect on domestic real interest rates, but also on global interest rates as well. And so there's an uncomfortable tension in some sense between the basic mechanics of this model and what we actually see happen in the U.S. and other large open economies. It turns out that there's a more unifying model that you can look at that marries both of these things together, but it's a lot more complicated, and I believe that it's available on the appendix, which is online for this particular chapter. So the takeaway here is that we can look at both of these models separately to help us understand what drives real interest rates in the long run and drives trade flows in the long run, but they don't separately allow us to think about how large economies might operate in terms of these two separate frameworks. Thank you.